And I just turned around and I hauled ass out of there. I was done. I wasn't dealing with that.
The hypocrisy of the cult is one of the things that turned me away the quickest.
When I turned my headlights on, it turned and looked at us. And one of the things I remember the most were the eyes were glowing red.
I see an orb of light. It is just circling these steps like it is waiting for me.
And he begins to tell them that he saw a UFO. They're basically like, what are you talking about? That's 7 foot up on a tree, peeking around it. And that's where I saw the top of the muzzle, nose, and the eyes. As soon as I made eye contact with this thing, it felt like death.
Welcome back to Tinfoil Tales. I'm your host, Brandon Wright. Tonight's episode, we're going to be joined by my guest, Brian. He is the host of Sasquatch Odyssey, among several other podcasts. I reached out to him a while back. He's one of the people I wanted to talk to. Has a pretty successful show here out in the podcasting world. Thought he'd be a great guest to have on here and share some of the stuff he's talked about with some of the guests he's had on his show. But before we bring Brian on, if you've ever had an experience and you'd like to be on an episode of Tinfoil Tales, there's 2 things you can do. You can send an email to tinfoiltalespodcast@gmail.com, or you can go to tinfoiltales.com and go to the contact section. Either way works, so make sure you get your message to me. We'll get something scheduled for a future episode. If you'd like to help the podcast out, please continue to share it around. Word of mouth is the best way to help the podcast grow. Every time you share it, there's a potential new guest that'll listen to the podcast for the first time. They'll reach out and have more episodes coming for you guys. You can also help out by leaving a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen to podcast at. If you happen to write one out, I'll make sure to try and share it on an upcoming episode. Give you guys a shout out. You can also help out by joining the Patreon. There are 2 different memberships. There's a free membership and the paid tier. The paid tier is $1.99 a month, but you get access to all of the episodes early. They're all ad-free. There's also exclusive content on there just for the paid memberships, like the live videos and some other things that are available. But regardless, all members get access to Crinkle Conspiracies, the new podcast I'm doing with Ed Corella that dives into weekly current events and some other conspiracy topics we dive into that I don't cover here on Tinfoil Tales. So if you're interested in joining the Patreon, make sure to check out the show notes. There's a link for it in there. Also in the show notes, there's a link to the merch store that is now available. If you're interested in rocking a Tinfoil Tales shirt or a sticker or something like that, you can find it in the merch store. Again, the link for that is also in the show notes. I will be appearing at 4 different events this fall, starting with Bigfoots and Brews and Spirits 2 in Wajack, Michigan. That's on September 14th. On September 27th and 28th, I'll be at the first annual Indiana Bigfoot Conference down in Nashville, Indiana. I'll have a booth set up at both of those for vendoring, but I'll have my recording rig. So make sure to stop by. Got a story you'd like to share? I'm sure we can sit down and record it. In October, I'll be appearing at ParaUnity 6 here in Miami County, Indiana. That's on October 19th. And on October 26th, I'll be in Crawfordsville, Indiana for the first annual Crawfordsville Paranormal Convention. I'll have a booth at both of those as well, but I'll also be speaking. Those are free and available for all ages, so make sure to stop by if you're around Indiana. Make sure to follow me around on all social medias, Facebook, Instagram, X. If you're on Facebook, look for Brandon Tinfoil Tales. Make sure to follow me on there. You can also reach out to me on there to try and get something scheduled. But I think now we're going to go ahead and bring Brian on. I've been looking forward to talking with him. He's got a lot of information and a lot of different guests he's talked to, so I know there's going to be a lot of interesting topics we're going to talk about tonight. So I hope you guys enjoy our conversation. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. I'd like to take this time to welcome my guest tonight, Brian. Thanks for coming on here and talking to me.
Yeah, man, I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, I enjoy talking to fellow podcasters every now and then. Do you want to let the audience know who you are and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am now a full-time podcaster. I was not always that. I did 16 years in law enforcement. I was a City of Atlanta police officer, left that in 2016, and bounced around a little bit. We ended up moving out of Georgia, and I purchased 40 acres of land here in North Carolina with the hopes of possible Bigfoot activity. We'll certainly get into that, I'm sure, at some point in time. But yeah, man, I was always interested in cryptids, Bigfoot, grew up in some haunted houses, had some UFO experiences early on in life. So I was always into weird things and cryptids. And I started listening to podcasts probably at this point about 5 years ago. And I never listened to a podcast before. And somebody said to me, I was in music, I'd recorded music, sang in bands all of my life, and done a couple of albums in the past, and I was into production and those kind of things. And somebody was like, why don't you listen to podcasts? You're into history and some other things, and there's a lot of cryptid stuff out there. So I started listening to my first encounters based podcast specifically about Bigfoot about 5 years ago. And I really got back into the subject. When you're a cop, you don't go to work every day and talk about Bigfoot and UFOs. At least I didn't do that as a police officer. So I was able to sort of rekindle that old flame, if you will, and my interest in those things after I left that job. So I started listening to the podcast, and I thought, man, that really makes me want to talk to people who have had these experiences. It's one thing to listen to the podcast and hear other people telling their stories and the person behind the microphone asking the questions. And there was always things that I wanted to know that never got asked. And there's things that I would go into that they never went into. So I was like, man, I really want to talk to these people myself. So I guess it was late 2020, I guess. I started reaching out to people in a bunch of Facebook groups about Bigfoot. I was going in the group saying, hey, is there anybody that's had experiences, especially in the southeastern United States? I was born and raised in Georgia. I now live in North Carolina. I wanted to talk to people who had had those kind of experiences in the areas that I grew up and were surrounding the area where I grew up. So I started reaching out to people, and people started responding saying, yeah, man, I live in Georgia and I had this experience. And somebody was in North Carolina, and somebody was in Tennessee and Alabama and the Carolinas. And I was like, wow, there's really people having these experiences in these areas, because most of the time when you think about Bigfoot specifically, it's usually South or Pacific Northwest. It's in California, it's in those areas, but it's not anywhere in the southeastern United States. But there were people having these experiences. So I started hooking up with these people saying, hey, I'd like to talk to you about your experience. And then, of course, I thought, well, it's one thing to talk to them, but how am I going to document this? Because other people might be interested in it. I might want to go back at some point in time in the future and listen back to this person's story and maybe compare it to somebody else that I talked to. So I thought, why don't I start a podcast? Well, that sounds like a great idea, but I had no clue how to podcast. I didn't have any equipment. I had no idea how to get on a platform. I had no idea what I was doing. So the first couple of episodes, probably, I'd say the first 10, 15, maybe even 20 episodes of Sasquatch Odyssey were recorded using a horrible free app on my iPhone to record conversations with people. And then I tried to edit best I could with limited knowledge and put it out there for folks. And like most podcasts, nobody's listening, right? I was like, it's like, you see the numbers, you see the downloads. There was like 20 people listening, then there was 30. And then I was doing 100. And then, it just started snowballing. Honestly, I produced the first episode of Sasquatch Odyssey in February of 2021. And I think mid-year, I was probably 4 or 5 months in to that first year, I started seeing a significant amount of downloads. And Wes from Sasquatch Chronicles emailed me. And anybody who's into Bigfoot and podcasts probably has listened to Wes's show. It's like the #1 Bigfoot podcast in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, hey, man, I listened to your show. I think it's great, but your audio sucks. Let me help you with that. So we got on the phone and we spent hours on the phone over the course of a couple of days. He gave me a list of things to order and things that he used. I used the same board to this day that I'm sure Wes is still using. And it changed the show overnight, and the audio quality got better. The more I did the interviews, I'd already interviewed people as a cop, but it's a completely different scenario when you're talking to somebody on a 911 call. You're trying to get to the bottom of a possible crime or auto accident or domestic violence situation. You're talking about Bigfoot. It's a different way to interview people. And that was sort of a an Achilles heel, if you will, or a handicap for me going into it, because I didn't want to be known as that guy with the Bigfoot podcast that will interrogate you about your experience. He's a former cop, he's going to browbeat you into submission and talking about whatever it is that you think you saw. And I didn't want to be that guy because I'm not that guy. So I was fighting that battle. And then obviously, Wes reached out, we got together, and the audio quality improved on the show. And then, towards the end of 2021, I was working a full-time job. I was in retail management. I was running an auto parts super hub here, 50 minutes or so away from the house. I was driving almost 2 hours a day round trip. I was working 50, 60 hours a week, supervising 50 people, and I was miserable. The only thing that really made me happy was being here on my property, being in the woods, and doing my podcast. And we had monetized the podcast. I'd had enough listeners that we started monetizing, and I was making pretty good money. I was almost replacing my pretty hefty salary doing this job that I hated, doing the podcast. And I just got to this point, I think it was March of 22. I said, if I'm going to do this, I've got to give it the old college try, and I've got to devote full time into this. So I gave myself 3 months. I went to my better half and said, look, I think this podcast thing can work. I need to step away from doing this retail job, and I'm going to give it a go. So that's what I did. March of 2022, I left that full-time job behind and started podcasting full-time, and I've never looked back, man. It's been the best decision of my life. I've never had as much fun as I'm having doing my job over these last couple of years. And I've started multiple podcasts. I host 4 full-time podcasts that go out each week. We started a network of podcasts. We have other podcasters that do shows on our network, and we network with a lot of people. I help a lot of people with their shows. Now that I've learned what I'm doing, I'm able to teach other people, and I try to do that as much as possible. I could probably name drop several, 5 or 6 shows that I'm sure most of your listeners probably have heard, and I've probably helped that podcaster in some way, shape, form, or fashion as much as I can behind the scenes to help grow their show, because, a lot of things are competitive. Bigfoot is one of them. Cryptids is podcasting can be very competitive, but my approach to podcasting and just cryptids research, any and all of the above, is the better we all do. If your show is one of the best that anybody's ever heard as far as audio quality and production quality, and it captures your audience immediately, they're going to fall in love with your show. They're going to fall in love with podcasting in general. And if your show is similar to mine, then they're going to search for more, because they're eventually going to catch up in your catalog. They're going to run out of something to do. And podcast people listen to multiple shows. So I've always looked at it that way. If I help somebody behind the scenes and I help them improve their show, very much like Wes did to me, it's passing it on. It's karma for me. If I can pass that on to more podcasters and help them with their show, the better my show is going to do, because more people are going to be interested. If they tune into a podcast about cryptids, Bigfoot specifically, and the first one they land on in their podcatcher is a crappy show with horrible audio and bad interviews, they're probably never going to come back. So I want them to find my show eventually. So I try to pass that on as much as possible, because I've learned so much, and I've had help from Wes, and the rest I've pretty much put together on my own. But that's kind of how I fell into the podcasting thing, and I've never looked back, man. It's one of the greatest things, like I said, is the greatest decision I've ever made. I've never been happier. And who knew you could make a great living doing podcasting and writing books and traveling around doing conferences talking about Bigfoot, man? If I'd known this 15, 20 years ago, I'd be much happier, I'm sure.
Yeah. When it comes to podcasting, though, like, your story is very similar to what happened with me. I had a weird experience that happened that actually kind of got me into the whole cryptid side, because I was pretty much a skeptic. And I had a weird experience in 2007, which kind of got me into this whole idea of believing that there's some weird stuff out there. But I was a musician. I did vocals in a metal band, so I had all the recording stuff for music purposes. So I didn't ever do anything podcast wise up until 2022, because the band stuff's kind of just wasn't doing anything with it. Like, we kind of stopped in 2020 when the whole world was kind of shut down for a little bit. And that's when I started looking into podcasting. And I had this great idea that I was going to start a podcast that talked about cryptids and UFOs and aliens and conspiracies and all this other stuff. Like, I bet no one's out there doing that. Lo and behold, I was wrong, and I come across Wes's show. And that was the first podcast that I ever really listened to was Sasquatch Chronicles. So I listened to that and I heard someone talk about he'd interviewed that judge about Dogman. And that's kind of where I came from is I literally saw an upright walking canine back in 2007. And I never really heard anyone else talk about something like that. So it really piqued my interest. And then listened to his show. I come across a couple others. And then from there, it's just like, you know what? I'm going to do this. So 2 years ago, I started the podcast and it's just been steadily growing. So I can't complain either.
Yeah, that was one of the things that surprised me was how many podcasts there are out there. There's hundreds and hundreds of Bigfoot podcasts. There's tons of Dogman podcasts. Dogman was something that was never really on my radar until I got heavily into the Bigfoot thing. And it just seemed to be sort of the gateway drug, the gateway cryptid, if you will. Bigfoot takes you into all these other realms.
Mm-hmm.
And I started hearing people talking about Dogman. And I've interviewed a couple of people over the last 2-3 years. I think I've maybe a handful of people at this point, maybe 4 or 5 people that have claimed to have some sort of experience with a Dogman. And I'll be honest with you, I'm still on the fence about it. I don't know what box to check. I can't wrap my brain around a 6 or 7 foot tall, upright, canid creature that's walking around in the woods. I've always felt it was some sort of a misidentification. Or here's the thing, I'm a flesh and blood kind of guy when it comes to Bigfoot, and I'm still not all in on the Bigfoot thing. If people listen to my show, I mean, we're almost 500 episodes into the show at this point, and it goes back and forth for me. I get emails all the time. Somebody left me a 1-star review on Apple because I still say to this day, 5 days out of 7, I'm still not exactly convinced that Bigfoot is completely real. I've had experiences that I can't explain, but I haven't seen one of these things. So until I actually lay eyes on it, I'm never going to be 100%. But Dogman has been one of those things that has always fascinated me. But there's clearly a there because people like Vic Cundiff and others that have Dogman shows that are specific about those encounters, they're 800-900 episodes in. So clearly either there's some sort of mass delusion that's going on, people are 100% whole cloth making up all their stories, or there's something to it. And I've always said, to me, Dogman may be one of those things. I certainly believe in the afterlife. I've had some experience with hauntings and things in the past, in my own experience, personally experienced them. So I believe in the afterlife. I believe there's something that goes on after we pass away. I think there's something to possibly demonic creatures or nefarious creatures that are outside of our realm. And it only made sense to me that Dogman, if they exist and people are seeing what they think they see, there's got to be something more to them than just a flesh and blood creature, because I can't check that box on how or where they would exist in the natural world. An upright 9-foot tall ape walking around in North America is a hard pill to swallow as well.
Mm-hmm.
But at least in the fossil record, there are feasible things that it could be. People go to Gigantopithecus, people go to Australopithecines. There's all kinds of theories out there on what these things might be. Paranthropus, I think Matt Pruitt stuck on that. So that's a possibility. But Dogman, man, I'd love to get you on the show and talk. I'd love to have you on and talk about your experience, because I'd like to add that to my category of, my catalog of people, because again, it's only been a handful of people out of almost 500 plus interviews that have made it onto the show. And there's tons that don't even make it on the show that I've done outside of that. And there's been very few people who have had those experiences of what they believe to be Dogman. So I don't know. It's a fascinating thing, man. But again, Bigfoot's the same way, There are people experiencing something. We know the phenomenon is real. There's no doubt about that. People are experiencing things. And like I said, I've had experiences myself. I went up, did an expedition last year with Todd Standing. Anybody who's into Bigfoot probably, knows Todd's name. Discovering Bigfoot documentary, one of the biggest documentaries in the last probably 10 years on Bigfoot. And Todd's a very controversial figure. I've made no qualms about my feelings about Todd before, during, and after going on the expedition, spending 7 days with him up in Radium. But I had some experiences there I can't explain. I've had experiences here on my own land in North Carolina I can't explain. I had an experience when I was 12 with what I believe to be a possible Bigfoot that I can't explain. So it's difficult to be all in. I'm definitely not a knower, as some people say. I want to be a believer because I believe in the people that I have on the show. And of course, there's people that have slipped through the radar. I'm sure you've probably experienced it if you do a ton of interviews. There are people who get by the gate and say, you're in the middle of the interview. Part of my secret sauce on the show is I don't do a whole lot of pre-interview, right?
Mhm.
I don't want to hear the story. I want to hear it for the first time when the person's on the show. And people have surprised me. The sex with a Sasquatch guy I had on last year was a surprise. I had no idea where that was going. Probably one of the wildest interviews I've ever had. This guy was completely convinced that he had this experience, and I sat on that for months, and I toiled over whether I was going to put that out there because I am a very serious person in the subject, and I want people to understand how serious I take the subject. And I knew that that was going to be a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. But I went to a couple of conferences. I was a speaker at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot conference a couple of years ago before I put this episode out. And I talked to hundreds of people that day, probably thousands, who came by my table. And the listeners of the show, I had a conversation with them and I asked them, if I put out an episode where this guy happened to hypothetically say, and everybody said, put it out. We'd love to hear that episode. It may be crazy. It may be, you may get some flack. We'd love to hear that episode. So I eventually put it out. But for the most part, it's a very, as mundane, I guess, as it can be, seeing a giant hairy hominid walking around in North America. Most of the stories on the show that you hear are pretty straightforward. I mean, some of them are pretty compelling. A lot of them are kind of scary. I've been doing a series lately on the show. I had a guy from Fred from Alaska. He's a Kurion tribal member up in Dillingham, Alaska. I had him on, did an interview. He's been on with Cliff and Bobo. I think Bobo heard him on my show, and then they stole him and brought him over on Bigfoot and Beyond. Cliff's a good friend of mine, so if you guys are listening, I'm my kid because I love. But Fred has tons of experience, not tons. He's had quite a few experiences with aggressive Bigfoot, aggressive Sasquatch in his area up there. And he's collected a ton of stories. He's got a pretty extensive catalog of these stories, and he just recounts them on his YouTube channel. And some of them are pretty hairy, man. No pun intended. They're pretty hairy stories of, people having to shoot their way out of cabins because these things are pretty aggressive. And I've never really heard as many stories about aggression as I've had from Alaska, but it runs the gamut, man. It's what keeps me coming back. Everybody's story is different. Everybody's experience is different. And that's one of the things I say all the time when I interview people on the show. Everybody takes little bits and pieces from each interview and each encounter story. And my philosophy is listen, take what you want and leave the rest. Whatever resonates with you, you take it. If you think they're full of crap and it's BS, then, maybe the next story will be different for you. But I pride myself on just giving people a space on Sasquatch Odyssey to come and tell their story, whatever that story is, whatever that experience is. Some of them get wild, and it is difficult for me to believe as a flesh and blood believer that people are having these woo or high strangeness experiences with Bigfoot cloaking and disappearing and coming in and out of portals and some of those things. That's a tough road to hoe for me to wrap my brain around those experiences. But who am I to say that that's not their experience? We've been chasing this thing for a lot of years. Bigfoot has been around for, it's been in the history books as long as history's been recorded, frankly. So people have had these experiences for a very long time, and we've been conventionally looking, and I say we just collectively as people. I consider myself a researcher of sorts. I do go out in the woods. I have been on expeditions and looked for these things and had experiences. So we've been doing that for a long time. And outside of some of the arguable things that people go to, like the Patterson-Gimlin film, I, for one, the Freeman footage from 92 sticks out to me as something that's potentially real. But outside of that, we have very little to go on, footprints, foot casts. I was up at the Ohio Bigfoot conference a couple of weeks ago, and I manned Cliff's booth with them. And Cliff sells these casts of some of these famous prints, the Grays Harbor print from, I think, 84, and some of the Freeman stuff. Michael Freeman, Paul Freeman's son, is a very good friend of mine. I just ordered a bunch of casts from him. I think he's sending me like 5 casts from his dad's collection. So there is evidence out there, but I've just recently, we have another show called That Bigfoot Podcast. If anybody's heard that, my co-host Wayne and I started that show specifically because if you do an interview based show, you don't do a whole lot of talking. Like, this is weird for me. I've guested on a bunch of podcasts, so I've gotten much more used to being the one on this side of the microphone. But typically my show is, hey, how are you doing? Tell me what got you started in Bigfoot. Let's get into your story. And then people talk for 45 minutes and I close out the show and that's it. So we started That Bigfoot Podcast to talk about some of the things that we don't get to talk about on our shows. Wayne is part of our network. He took over. I had a show called Paranormal Odyssey that I was hosting for a couple of years, and I turned that show over to Wayne about a year and a half ago. So he hosts that show. Great show if you guys are into that. He talks about everything: Bigfoot, dogman, ghost, clairvoyance. He gets into all the weird stuff, UFOs. So you guys give Paranormal Odyssey a listen if you're into that kind of stuff. But we started That Bigfoot Podcast because we wanted to talk about hoaxers. We wanted to talk about some of the evidence that's out there that we have an opinion on. So we get into that on that show, and that's sort of a space where we get to talk about some of these things. And I said all that to say, just recently, Wayne and I were talking on the show, and I said, look, dude, you know, the more I talk to people about some of this high strangeness that's going on, I wonder if we've been barking up the wrong tree for so long, because we've been out wood knocking and we've been out whooping and we've been out searching for tracks and trying to get pictures of these things and video of these things for decades and had very little success collectively in the community. So is there possibly more to these things? I mean, I even wrote in my book, Sasquatch Unleashed, The Truth Behind the Legend. I talk about some of the high strangeness stuff. And I said in the book, you know, for me, I think to get scientists involved, I think we have to separate the two. I think we have to pull away from the woo and the high strangeness in a lot of ways to get mainstream scientists interested enough in the subject to maybe push the ball down the field. But I still think there is a possibility that we should be looking in both places simultaneously, at least with a little bit of an open mind. You know, we're making some strides now with some of the DNA studies that Darby Orcutt is doing up at NC State here in my home state of North Carolina. They're actually testing DNA, and, you know, there's a ton of stuff that's being tested that I'm excited about. I think this is one of the things that has excited me the most over the last, I'd have to say probably 5 to possibly 10 years, honestly, in the subject, is this DNA study. There's the Melba Ketchum DNA study. I don't know if you're familiar with that, from, I don't know, 2013 or so.
Mm-hmm.
I won't even get into that. We've covered it on That Bigfoot Podcast. I certainly have my opinions about it. I think it's very flawed, to say the least. So I'll leave it at that. But I think what Darby's doing, and I actually got to hang out with Darby in Ohio, and we went out to dinner after the conference, and we were talking about that. It was Cliff, Doug Hychek was there at the dinner, and Doug from Monster Quest, Untold Radio Network. I'm sure people into Bigfoot are pretty familiar with Doug. Doug has sent Darby some very exciting things that I'm excited for him to test. So I think they're making some progress, but I just don't think DNA is going to get it done, man. I think it's going to take a body. And if these things exist, I feel like we're on the cusp. I hope we're on the cusp of something happening sooner rather than later, because it just seems like we're in this washing machine on repeat with the same faked videos that seem to pop up every 4 or 5 months, and the same pareidolia pictures, and the same thing that we're just running over and over. And there's really nothing new happening. And I just feel like we're on the cusp, and I'm hoping that something's happening. I don't know, where are you on Bigfoot? Is that something that you've been interested in? How do you feel about the evidence, and where are you on this thing being real or not?
I've always been a skeptic, like I said, up until what I saw. And just as of a few years ago, I figured, you know what? It's plausible there could be an upright walking primate. But theoretically, when you think about it, it doesn't make any sense as to why you don't find any evidence of it, as far as like you don't find a body. You've never come across any bones. You don't find a whole lot of like trace evidence. But then think about people that go out hunting. How often do they ever really come across a dead bear or a dead mountain lion? How often do they find a skull of a bear? Like it's very rare. So I thought about it. I was like, you know what? I could see like, especially out west, up north in Canada, it would make sense. And then when I actually started listening to other podcasts, because again, I was never a podcast person. I didn't listen to anything like that. I watched a few shows on TV like Finding Bigfoot or whatever. But when you start to listen to things, you start to listen to people's experiences and their accounts from what happened. You listen to the researchers. And then kind of like I was thinking flesh and blood, but then more and more interviews has turned into the woo side. And the only thing I can describe about all that is I was hesitant, but some of it you can't explain. And people are clearly seeing something, and I don't think it's completely misidentification all the way around. And even the thing that I'd saw, like if someone told me what happened to me, like if they told me my own encounter, I would think they're batshit crazy. That's just, but I saw it. So how am I going to write off what anyone else seen? Because I struggle to even believe what I seen. Because it doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as an upright walking canine. Like it's impossible. But I saw what I saw. So I'm not here to ridicule anyone else that's seen some weird stuff too, because if I can't explain what I saw and don't even want to believe what I saw, what is these other people seeing that I can say that, well, this person's making it up or whatever? I've had people that have come on here and I can tell after we start doing the interview, kind of like what you do. I go in pretty much blind. Like they tell me, oh, I've had this encounter, or whatever. I say, don't tell me all their information. I want to hear it. So I pay more attention if I don't know what's happening. If someone writes out this big long email and says every detail about it, I already kind of know where it's going to go. So it's kind of better for me to go in not so much not prepared, but keeps me interested and find out where the story's going. But I've had people to come on here that said some weird stuff, nothing about sex with Bigfoot, but there's been some out there things. But again, who am I to say that it's true or not? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not here to try and prove or disprove anybody. But when it comes to Bigfoot, I believe that there's something out there. I don't know what it is. I can't say if it's flesh and blood. I can't say if it's some interdimensional being, which keeps getting tossed around now. I can't say it's an alien. I don't know. But people are clearly seeing something.
Yeah, and that's what keeps me coming back, man. And I try to keep an open mind with people's experiences. You know, I spent so much time talking to people that are in the flesh and blood camp that have all but convinced me. You know, it's very difficult. I did a speaking gig last year up in Idaho with Cliff. Jeff Meldrum was there, Dr. Meldrum, and Michael Freeman, Paul Freeman's son. And we all went out to dinner, and you can't sit around the dinner table with Jeff Meldrum and Cliff Barrickman. At least I had a hard time walking away and not believing that something exists that is flesh and blood. I mean, they're very convincing in their experience. They're very convincing in the science. I mean, Jeff takes a look at these tracks and these casts and the way he articulates what he's seeing, and he's convinced that Patty is real just based on the footprints that were cast that day on the sandbar back in 67. Even if the video didn't exist, Meldrum would believe that Patty is an upright walking hominid of some sort. So it's very difficult to have conversations with people like Cliff and Jeff, and even Michael to an extent, and then have conversations with people who say Bigfoot comes out of portals and they teleport and they mind speak. And it's one of those things that I've tried so hard to reconcile just for my own sanity sometimes, because people are having these experiences. And I used to separate those. I'd have people on the show early on that would say, yeah, I've got Bigfoot activity. They're scary on my property. They've scared my kids. They've left tracks. We've heard sounds. We've heard vocalizations. They've thrown rocks at us. And then I would ask, any other weird stuff going on? Yeah, we've had weird lights and we've seen what looks like alien craft, sometimes right before, sometimes even during some of the Bigfoot activity, and sometimes after. And I used to just separate those two and say, yeah, you got Bigfoot activity and then you've got UFO stuff. I've had both, I think, not simultaneously, well, almost simultaneously in radium last October, but not exactly at the same time. But I never drew a correlation. I was always like, nah, it's kind of weird. You kind of throw the woo stuff to the side and you stick with what you want to believe, which for me is the flesh and blood stuff, right? And then the more people I'd talk to, credible researchers that I believe wholeheartedly don't have a dog in the fight to hoax me or lie to me, that would tell me they've been out on Bigfoot expeditions at places where there's habituation situations going on. Daryl comes to mind from Tennessee last year as one of those people. Daryl had some very real stuff going on around his house. These things were tearing down fences and he was having issues with them. And then he had a habituation situation he was trying to help these people with, he and a couple of other investigators, because they were claiming that the Sasquatch were getting very aggressive, and they went out there to try to help them with this. He has a situation where he's out on this investigation and they're having all this activity, and an orb comes floating down the hill at him and turns into a possum in front of him. And he's telling me this, and I'm like, what do you do with that? I said, and he said, Brian, I know, I can see your face. I know you probably think I'm crazy. I think it's crazy, but that's what happened to me. I mean, why would he say that, right? I mean, why would he make up a story about Bigfoot activity and then tell me that an orb turned into a possum in front of him? And it just blew my mind. But you hear so many of those stories, and you have to, at least I've come to the conclusion, I think there's probably some sort of connection in a lot of cases. I don't think necessarily all cases, but I think there is a common thread, at least, between some of the things that people experience. I'm very much into UFOs. I don't do a ton of UFO stuff anymore. I stick primarily with the Bigfoot thing because that's just, honestly, for the show, that's where my audience is. So I have to give them what they want, but I'm very interested. Again, I've had a couple of UFO experiences, so I like talking to people about that. Preston Dennett is one of those people that I have interviewed a couple of times. He's had a couple of people that he's recommended. There was a lady, and forgive me, I forget her name, who had some really wild UFO experiences. And Preston reached out and said, hey, we just finished her book. She's put everything into a book and we'd like to come on your show and promote it. And I said, sure. Brought her on, and she had a wild UFO story about being trained from when she was a child to fly alien craft around the galaxy. It's a long, drawn out story. She is 100% convincing. I walked away from that thinking this lady she is absolutely batshit crazy, or she's making this up whole cloth, or this might have actually happened. I just don't know where I'm landing on this right now. But I said all that to say, during many conversations with people like Preston Dennett, Stan Gordon, huge UFO investigator, Bigfoot investigator, he's been in this for almost 6 decades. I've had conversations with those guys, and they've said to me, Brian, everything is connected. They just kept saying that over and over. Brian, everything is connected, man. Because I would say, yeah, this weird stuff happened to this person, but I don't think it's connected to Bigfoot. And they just look at me like I'm crazy. Like, no, trust me, everything's connected. So I don't know, man. It's wild. I mean, up in Radium last year, we had some Bigfoot activity. I heard some wood knocks. I heard what sounded like samurai chatter. We had rocks thrown at us a couple of times. We heard whoops. We heard other weird vocalizations. We heard what sounded like rock clacking together, what sounded like rocks being smacked against wood, possibly trees. And then the one night, I think it was the second night we were there, we had tons of UFO activity. We watched probably 10 or 12 of these UFOs, probably 80, 85,000 feet ahead above us, traveling 2,000, 3,000 miles an hour, stopping, making left-hand turns on a dime, 90-degree turns in opposite direction. It was wild. It was one of the wildest UFO experiences I've ever had. I've had a close-up encounter with a UFO when I was 16 with my mom. We saw one about 600-800 feet away from us, hovering over us. This was a completely different scenario, and it's something like I've never seen before. We'll probably never experience again. I don't think that was connected to Bigfoot, obviously. I mean, we were having some things that we had heard earlier in the night, some vocalizations, a couple of whoops, and I don't know if we had rocks thrown at us that night or not, but to experience that and then try to draw a correlation with the UFOs that were 80,000 feet above us, probably not connected. But there are so many stories where people, I mean, I've had people on that have claimed to have seen Bigfoot walking off of a alien craft that landed. I mean, that's a pretty big correlation, man. I mean, when somebody physically sees one of these things walking off of a UFO, I don't know what you do with that. There's got to be some sort of a common thread or a connection there. I don't know.
A lot of people out there, like a lot of people I've talked to recently, they all are on the same mindset that it's all connected. And I'm starting to lean that way myself because I don't want to say aliens and Bigfoot and cryptids and spirits and everything else, but one way or another, they all seem to be somehow intertwined. And I can't explain any of that to make any sort of logical sense, especially to someone that's like not a full on believer. But a lot of the weird stuff that goes on, I do feel like is somehow connected. I don't know how to describe it other than that.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way, man. And people have said to me recently, I don't remember who it was that I was having a conversation with on the show. They were saying, you know, I know you're having a tough time with this high strangeness stuff and these Sasquatch possibly being, spiritual beings or interdimensional beings. And I mean, they kind of brought it back to reality a little bit for me and said, human beings are spiritual beings. If you believe that human beings have a soul, and I'm not necessarily talking religion here, I'm not talking about buying into any type of organized religion where you go to heaven or hell or, you got to have your soul saved. I'm not talking about any of that, but just if you believe that we are more than just this body. And I tend to believe that. I'm not a religious person and I'm not really even a spiritual person, honestly. But I do believe that something happens to our soul. I believe that we have something that makes us us, right? Because when people die, something happens, right? The light goes out, you're done. But I don't think that energy is destroyed. I agree that energy is neither, you can't destroy energy. It's going to go somewhere. I'm just not sure where it goes. And if that's the case, and I believe that about people, which I do, could it be possible that Sasquatch would be the same or very similar to us as sentient beings? Sure, I believe that's possible. And I do believe that I have met at least a couple of people that I believe have some extraordinary abilities. Sometimes it's psychic stuff. Maybe it's people who are clairvoyant. I've met some very extraordinary people that I think have possibly extra sensory powers. Some people even can telepathically connect with other people. Some people claim they can do it with animals. Astral projection. I've had people claim that they can do that. And there's some people that I have a hard time not believing because of some of the things that they've been able to describe and talk to me specifically about. So I don't know if Sasquatch is a flesh and blood creature, can it have some of those abilities? Certainly I do. I think that is definitely possible. But that's always been my argument as a flesh and blood believer in these things. As much of a believer as I am, I'm about 80% there on their existence. It's hard for me to say that they have some of these powers, like telepathic communication is one of the big things that we hear, mind speak in Bigfoot. And that's always been a rub for me. But I've had conversations with people. I've had Les Stroud, Survivor Man Les Stroud on the show. And Les told me several times, 3-4 times, I think this guy said he had what he believes to be a telepathic connection with Bigfoot. And it's a big thing for Todd Standing now. He and Ash, his main research partner up there, his girlfriend and research partner, they are into the mind speak thing. They claim that they can connect telepathically with these clan of Sasquatch that are in that radium area on a regular basis, and they talk to them and have conversations with them. I take everything that comes from Todd with a grain of salt. I always have and always will. But, could I be wrong? Could they really be having those connections? Could it be something outside of themselves? And that's what I've always said. I even said it to Les. I don't think I said it on the air. I told him privately, either before or after we talked on air, I said, man, I think it's more of a sixth sense that we all have. And I told him the story I've told on the show plenty of times about being in a situation on the police force. I did a lot of DUI, so I worked overnight shifts for a couple of years. I was like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And I stopped a lot of cars. That's what I did, a lot of traffic stops. I tried to stop this car one night. They just kept rolling, just kept going. Take a left turn. They were pulling me into a darker area behind a building. That's where we ended up. There was like 5 guys in this car. I was a little apprehensive about it. I was pretty gung ho. It took a lot to scare me. I wasn't rattled by much when I was on the street because I'd been shot at a couple of times. I'd been through the ringer. You know, I always joke like 10 minutes as a police officer on the streets of Atlanta is like 10 years in other places. So I really wasn't concerned, but there was something before I got out of my patrol car to walk up to the driver's side of that car. Anybody who's ever been stopped by the police, I bet you, if you've been stopped 5 times in your life, every time the police officer does the same thing. Gets out of the car, walks up to your driver's side window and asks you for your driver's license and your insurance card or whatever the protocol is for the state that you're in. I got out of my patrol car, but right before I did, something said, do not walk to the driver's side of this car. Just don't do it. And the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The hair on my arm stood up. And I listened. It didn't sound like my voice. It was just something subconsciously said, do not walk up to that car. Don't do it. But I've got the car stopped. I've got to make contact with the people, right? I can't just sit in my car. So I backed up. I had the lights on. I had the takedown lights. I had the spotlight on the driver. No, but they couldn't see me coming, right? I backed up fell behind my patrol car, and I walked up on the passenger side of this vehicle. And I looked inside. I could see it was lit up because of the lights, the takedown lights and the spotlight. There's 5 guys in the car, 2 in the front, 3 in the back. Everybody was turned to their left, looking backwards on the driver's side of the car. And I looked in the front seat, the driver's side, and the driver had a .45 pistol in his hand. He was going to shoot me when I walked up to the driver's side of the car. So that wasn't Bigfoot, dude. Bigfoot mind speak to me. Nobody in the car mind spoke to me. I don't know where that came from. I just think it was me knowing something's wrong. Like, this guy didn't stop immediately. He wasn't running from me. He was driving under the speed limit, but he made 4 or 5 turns and they didn't stop until they got me into this dark area behind this building. Of course, I'm an experienced police officer at that point. I know something's wrong, right? And I think that's what happens to a lot of people in the woods. I mean, you go out in the woods, if you're a hunter or an experienced outdoors person, maybe you're camping, hiking, whatever, you get a feeling about something's wrong. We all do it when you walk into a room. If you go to a party, there can be 10, 15, 30 people in the room. You know instinctively if somebody's staring at you. How many times have you done that? You have this feeling that somebody's looking at you, and you look and you stare somebody right in the face, and then they look away because they've been staring at you for whatever reason.
I was literally getting ready to say that when you were done talking. It's like, I think people have like that sixth sense of, because you can tell when like you get that feeling like you're being watched. Like, if sometimes you look around, you're like, someone's looking at me, and turn around and look at someone staring at you, and they turn their head real quick. So it's funny you kind of brought that up.
Yeah, and it's a very common thing that you hear particularly in Bigfoot experiences, whether it ends up in a sighting or it's just some other weird things like rock throwing and things like that. People always say, I feel like I'm being watched in that area. It happened. I did an interview just last night for the show that'll eventually air. And the guy kept saying, every time my friends and I would walk into this area when we were kids, we all felt uncomfortable. We would only go past this certain spot and we would stop because we felt like we were being watched. Who knows what that was? Maybe it was a cougar. Maybe it was a mountain lion. I mean, there's so many things in the woods that can and I've experienced that. I've been in the woods here on my property and experienced that a couple of times. I never saw what it was. I don't know if it was a bear. We know we've ran into black bear here a couple of years ago while hiking. So we know there's bears. I think I found big cat sign here. I think a big cat might have taken one of my dogs a couple of years ago. So there's all kinds of things on these 40 acres. I don't necessarily think it's anything nefarious outside of just natural things that people experience. And we tend to assign more spiritual things or more interesting things to some of our experiences just because that's what human beings do. And if you're into Bigfoot and you're in the woods and you have that experience, of course it's got to be Bigfoot, right? And I'm not saying that that's not what people are experiencing. I'm just saying I tend to be more of an Occam's razor guy, and I try to go to those places first, even with my own experiences. So I don't know. It's just interesting. And the mind speak thing has always been it's an unproven thing for me. I can't say yay or nay, but that's what I tend to go to when people tell me those stories is I have my own experience with that. And that's happened on multiple times. I mean, that was probably the most dramatic time that I can recall that I've had that experience. And it turned out to be right. Had I walked up to that driver's side of that car, I don't know what would have happened. I may not even be here right now had I not listened to whatever that voice was. So I'm certainly glad I did. I just didn't attribute it to anything. I didn't know if it was an angel. I've had grandparents pass away. Was it one of them telling me? I don't know. It could have been. I just tend to think that I was listening to my own experience. And somehow I was just letting my body was letting me know, don't do that, dude. Do something different. Don't do what you've done 1,000 times because you're probably not going to make it. Just do something different. And I did. And here I am. But, it's easy, I think, when you're into something like Bigfoot or cryptids or even ghosts. People freak themselves out when they go ghost hunting and every little bump in the night becomes a ghost. I don't know, man. I try to take that in and say, okay, that's possible, but let's look at another angle here and see if it might be something other than mind speak.
I'm the same way when it comes to stuff like that. And you mentioned paranormal. I went on 2 different paranormal investigations in my life, and I left more disappointed because the people that I was with said everything was paranormal. One of the buildings we were in was from like the early, well, it was built in like 1880 something. So it's over 100 years old. The wiring's not the greatest, and there's all sorts of other things. So every little noise they'd hear, if their meter jumped or a little bell, it's paranormal. It's something's communicating with us. I was like, or it's just bad wiring, like magnetism. You know what I mean? Like, not everything is a ghost. Not everything's a spirit. So that really soured me on trying to go off on these investigations because I've always been skeptical. So for me, I'm always trying to write off everything I can rationally. And then if you can't write it off rationally or explain it, then you can say, okay, well, then this is unexplainable. This might be paranormal. But when you go in there expecting everything to be a ghost, then you're just making everything ghost. You know what I mean? Like you're not really doing a very good investigation. You being a cop, you understand what I'm saying. Like you're trying to find actual evidence.
Exactly. And that's what I had to do when I went into Radium because I was fully expecting to be hoaxed. I had called Todd out as a hoaxer for years, a couple of years on the show. And I was expecting that I knew he wanted me to come up there. He had made no qualms about the fact that he wanted me to come up there and have some experience that I would then go back and talk about on my show because he knows I have a huge audience. And he knows that if people hear me sort of giving the blessing for Todd and his expeditions, people are probably going to book those expeditions
and put money in his pocket.
Right. So I figured I just had this feeling that I was going to be hoaxed. And I actually, I had a conversation with a couple of people right before I went. I think Doug Hychek might have been one of them. I know I had a conversation with Wayne, my co-host on that Bigfoot podcast, and they were like, dude, have you ever considered that, you've always said, meaning me, I've always said on the show, I believe that Todd has had experiences with Bigfoot. I think he's probably seen a Bigfoot at least a couple of times. But I don't believe his videos are real. And I don't believe 95% of the shit that he puts forward as evidence is real. I've always been on that side of the fence. But they said, have you ever considered that he might be having experiences in this area that you're going to? What if you see one? What if you have experiences that aren't hoaxed? How are you going to process that? Are you going to be able to process that? So I really had to, I called it a cleansing. I just sort of had to cleanse my brain and go, okay, I'm going to put that out of my mind and I'm going to go in with a clean slate and just say, I'm going to take every experience that happens to me and I'm going to process it in real time. And I'm going to make a determination of where's Todd? Could I be hoaxed? If not, then what could it be? And exactly what I did. And I tell you, man, we were 18 miles deep in the woods. There was nobody out there besides us. Nobody. And most of the things that I experienced, Todd was either hundreds of miles away or he was sitting right next to me. And there was nobody else that could have been making the noises or doing the things that we were hearing, seeing, and experiencing. There was a couple of times we had rocks and stuff thrown at us, and we went and woke Todd up. And he came back into the experience with us, and it continued. So, I can't explain that. I don't know what it was. I didn't see a Sasquatch throw rocks at me. I didn't see him vocalize. I didn't see anything that would be definitive to say it was a Bigfoot. Now, one of the guys that was there with me and just interviewed him, I think his interview's posting tomorrow, as a matter of fact, did say he came out at 3:00 in the morning to use a bush, and he's pretty sure he saw a Sasquatch. And I did find what I believe to be where the thing was standing. So, I don't know. It's an interesting subject, man. I too, like you, I'm very skeptical about even my own experiences, but I do believe, I think we both agreed there's something to the phenomenon. People are experiencing something. The phenomenon is certainly real, and that's what keeps me coming back for more, man. I just hopefully want to get to the bottom of it for myself. You said something very interesting earlier. You're not out to prove anything. And I'm not necessarily out to prove anything to anybody else. I'm out to prove it for myself. I want to prove one way or the other these things are real. And by proxy, the tens of thousands of people that listen to my show every week will then hopefully be on that ride with me if it eventually happens. But I think it's just going to take a body for me. I don't know, short of that, if I could see, maybe some ultra 8K video tomorrow that might be convincing. I don't know. I just doubt that that's going to happen. I think it's going to take a body for me to be 100% convinced. I think the DNA stuff is interesting. I think it's, we can figure out what something isn't, maybe. I don't think DNA is going to take it any further than that for me. So I think it's going to take that proverbial body, man. Well, in this case, it'd be a literal body, or possibly two, to prove it for me.
I'm kind of the same way. When it comes to DNA, there's all sorts of things that it can say it's not, but doesn't really. If you don't have a specimen already, it's just going to come back as unknown. That's still not proving to anyone else that it's a Bigfoot. You know what I mean? Like, oh, it's an unknown species. Okay, well, is that the big 9-foot tall monkey man walking in the woods? I mean, you have trace evidence of that, but some people can say it's contaminated or whatever. There's always going to be skeptics. And when it comes to buying into a lot of the stuff, it's hard to do it unless, like you said, you have a body. I don't think the most hardcore skeptic is going to believe anything until mainstream comes out. We're like, nope, this is Bigfoot. Here's a corpse. And I have a strong inkling that I don't see that happening anytime soon. Just my own experiences and with talking with people and everything else. I'm not going to say that there's a worldwide government conspiracy covering up Bigfoot. But you would think if these things are real, at some point, someone would have came across something. I work in the construction field. When I first started my job years ago, we were building a brand new highway. So we were going through the woods, building a road, a 4-lane road that wasn't going through there. And that kind of put me in perspective think about all the construction that goes on everywhere. A lot of forests get taken down. A lot of things get taken down. You've never found a skeleton. You've never found any sort of evidence. But some people, they found grave sites. They found bones here. Oh, job gets shut down. But you've never heard of them finding any sort of remains of a Sasquatch. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible or it hasn't happened, but why the big secret? That's where I always scratch my head back at too, is like, what is the purpose? What are they hiding? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I've never got into that big worldwide conspiracy. I've always joked that I worked for the government when I was a police officer, albeit it was a local government, city of Atlanta. You would be surprised what they didn't know and what we didn't know. Everybody thinks the government knows everything about everything. No. Usually the left hand has no idea what the right hand's doing. One of them's usually corrupt and the other one doesn't know about it. so much that goes into that. And I don't think that there's even enough infrastructure for enough people to be involved in that. But I do think I've heard stories. I've talked to people who have said they have seen, like, forest rangers, for example, get called out on what people believe to be potential Sasquatch footprints. And they literally go, that's a bear. And then they take their foot and rub across, yeah, and destroy the evidence, right? I think that happens probably a lot because for any myriad of reasons, right? If you're a forest ranger and you think that Bigfoot's going to be discovered in your area, you may be out of a job because people are going to stop coming to the park or whatever the case. You never know what people are going through or what their brain's saying. But just in general, I don't think there's this huge cover up. If the government does know these things exist, they probably know way more about them than we will ever know. But that's probably the extent of it. I don't think they have one somewhere. I had some guy write an email. Wayne and I talked about it recently on that Bigfoot podcast. He was like, when they find all the live Sasquatch on the mountains, they take them to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And I was like, dude,
everything goes there.
Dude, how do you know that? Do you have any proof, or you're just watching too many documentaries? I mean, come on, dude.
That's where the Roswell crash was taken too, supposedly.
Exactly. I mean, it's just buzzwords at this point. Like, you have no proof of that, dude. It's just, come on. I'm sure Kennedy's there. I'm sure some of the Kennedy evidence is probably there too. I mean,
Elvis is there.
Yeah, Elvis. Jimmy Hoffa's probably buried under Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I mean, come on. I need some evidence, man. People make these definitive statements. That's one of the things I get into all the time with people. Anybody who makes a definitive statement concerning Bigfoot or really any cryptid or anything UFO related, if you start talking in definitives like I know, I'm usually cutting you off, dude. I'm probably going to have a conversation with you. I'm going to listen to you, but I'm probably not going to take anything you say with any seriousness after that, because nobody knows anything. Nobody knows anything definitively. It happens to me. I use a lot of AI for images for the show, like making thumbnails,
yeah,
interesting things for people to look at during the, episodes or whatever. And it never fails. Every time I put out any image of something that's Sasquatch related, I get emails or comments on social media. Oh, they don't look like that. Their nose doesn't look like that. How do you know? How do you know maybe my Bigfoot looks different than yours? But it's just these definitives that people get into. And I don't have time for that. Yeah. If you talk in definitives, you're probably talking out of both sides of your mouth. And I don't have time for that.
I've told my audience, and I've been on other podcasts, I've said the same thing, that if anyone comes up and tells you they're an expert in cryptids or aliens or paranormal or whatever, take whatever they say with a grain of salt, because there are no experts, because no one really knows anything. Like, everyone has opinions, but there's no concrete evidence to prove that any of this stuff even exists. So how can someone be an expert in them?
Yeah, man, I've had people that have either advertised me as a speaker at their conference or just coming on their podcast, and they put anything expert next to my name. I say, please take that off. I don't want to be associated with that. Don't call me that. I don't even want it to be implied that I have said that about myself, because I'm the same way. There is no such thing as any type of an expert when it comes to cryptids, anything Bigfoot related. It's just not, because again, we don't know anything. They're experts in their fields. Dr. Jeff Meldrum is certainly an expert in locomotion, bipedal locomotion, anthropology, but not Bigfoot. Jeff is not a Bigfoot expert.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, I mean, he's certainly been labeled at that, even to some degree. Cliff, he's very good. We were in Ohio a couple of weeks ago, and some guy had came fresh in from the field. As a matter of fact, I think he just interviewed him. I think Bobo and Cliff had them on Cliff and Bobo's podcast, Bigfoot and Beyond, this past week. These guys came in fresh out of the field with some really cool casts. And I've got a video on my phone. I was videoing Cliff as he was looking at these casts. He was fairly convinced that they looked real to him. I know Meldrum looked at him as well. And I think Jeff had some issues with something to do with the heel that looked a little off to him. So he wasn't exactly convinced. And I'm not saying Cliff was. I think he was, he was skeptical, of course, but he was pretty convinced that they were cool looking tracks. I at least saw that. Matt Pruitt went over and took a look at them as well, and he was pretty convinced by them. So Cliff is even one of those people that people have thrown the expert, but Cliff, he'll tell you, I'm not an expert on it. Cliff literally will say, I don't even know why the hell anybody cares about what I say. Like he's just that guy, why does anybody listen to me? I don't know, but they do. And that's fine. I think there's some validity to that because Cliff is one of those people I trust implicitly. I trust his opinion. I mean, he'll be the first to tell me, no, that's shit, dude. That's not, that's not anything. He's the one who I found the first track on my property. What, last summer. And we were hanging out in Idaho and I gave him my phone and I let him look at the picture I thought it was just a pareidolia footprint. I took a picture of it because I thought it was interesting. But the more I looked at it in real life, I thought, this actually looks like a footprint. I see 5 toes and it looks like a Sasquatch footprint in this little wet area of this creek that I'd crossed over on my property. And Cliff looked at the photo and he's like, dude, that looks like a Sasquatch footprint. Did you cast it? I'm like, no, I didn't cast it. Of course not. But I've casted everything since then. But, just things like that. Like he's very good at that, but he's not an expert. I mean, he's very good at what he does. He can tell a fake typically, and he can tell what he believes is real, but at the end of the day, who really knows, right? Until you have the body to compare it to, it's difficult to say one way or the other. But he's definitely one of those people that I trust. I trust Jeff in his opinion. I've sent him some things and he's come back with some opinions on them in the past, and I certainly appreciate that. But yeah, there's no such thing as a Bigfoot expert. I don't even want to be, I've written a book, I do a podcast, I've done speaking gigs. People see me and they think I'm an expert. No, I'm definitely not. I'm still learning and pushing my way through everything I do. I'm not even an expert podcaster. I'm okay at it. I'm not an expert, damn it.
Yeah, Cliff is actually someone I've been wanting to talk to for a while. He's on my list. I have a list of people that I want to reach out to. So Cliff's on there, Dr. Meldrum's on there. I have Ron Moorhead coming on next week. So looking forward to talking with him.
Ron's my neighbor, man. Well, not my next door neighbor. He and his better half moved to North Carolina, I think last year or year before last. So he's a fellow North Carolinian now. Jeff's a great person to get on the show. Cliff will probably not. He doesn't like to do his own podcast. I had to twist his arm to get him on my show. So good luck with that.
Yeah. But when you were talking about Todd Standing, I had to ask. The rumors are always thrown out there with Todd is his sister or whatever is a makeup effects artist or visual effects artist. When you were up there, did you happen to ever see this sister that he supposedly lives with?
I know his sister, yes. And she is not, but his ex-wife is.
Okay. Because I know that literally I always see it being tossed. Anytime Todd's name comes up, everyone's like, oh, his sister is a special effects person from Hollywood and everything was made up from her. And I was like, how do you guys know this? It's just as much as saying as Bigfoot is real or fake as they're making up a story about this guy's sister. Like, who has the evidence of any of that? They don't have any evidence of I don't believe Todd's videos at all. When I first seen it, I kind of laughed. I was like, really? Like, everyone was making such a big deal about the documentary. I kind of thought it was boring. And when they see all the evidence or whatever, I was let down. But that kind of happens when it comes to the cryptid documentaries, I've noticed. But I just wanted to know, like, I've heard people go up there and they claim they've met his sister and he lives with his sister and they're like, oh, she's not a special effects artist. So I didn't know if you'd actually had a chance to meet with her.
Yeah, Chantel is not a special effects artist. And I don't know that his wife was like a Hollywood special effects artist. I think she was more like a hairdresser that did makeup kind of thing. Like I don't know that anybody in his family or in his close circle is or was in like Hollywood special effects per se. And I'll be honest with you, man, I don't think they would have to be. Like you said,
Yeah.
if you look at what you see there, I think a collective could easily put together what you see in that documentary. And I mean, the last one, I think he calls it Kubota, what looks like Todd crawling under a
Tree
tree
branch.
with black shoe polish on his face. I mean, that's not Hollywood special effects, dude. That's black shoe polish on a dude's face, in my opinion.
Everyone points out to the blinking eyeball on the one that's supposed to be the female. None of them even look the same, which I thought was strange. Like, they're all supposed to be Sasquatch, but every one of them looks different. And the eyeballs look completely different. And then the one that winks, I was like, that looks so CGI to me. And I was like, Todd doesn't have access to CGI. He would have no way of faking that. I was like, they literally have that type of shit on your phone these days.
Yeah. And Todd is a very smart fella. He is not dumb. I had a lot of it's documented. I mean, I have put out hours of video and hours of audio from my trip up to Radium with us sitting around the campfire talking. And that was only a portion of the 7 days of pod that I got. He's not a dumbass. He knows exactly what he's doing. He is very convincing. He's very charismatic, and he is good at what he does. He is the best used car salesman on the lot. He could sell every lemon that you ever had and make you think you were getting sweet, cool lemonade.
He
He's
could have
very-
took a I was gonna say he could have took a different path in life, and instead of looking into Bigfoot, he could have became a cult leader.
Oh,
Just
yes.
because he has that charismaticness about himself.
Tons of people emailed after I started putting out those, I called them campfire sessions or whatever from my Radium trip last year. Every time I would play one of those, it would air on, I think I was doing them like every Friday. Every time those would air, people would just be so pissed off, and they'd fire off the emails. Oh my God, he's such a cult leader. David Koresh, he's Jim Jones made over. And, you know, when you're in the moment, you don't really see it with Todd, because I got on great with Todd. I mean, he welcomed me. I had talked a whole bunch of shit about this dude on my show. Like, I trashed him on my show, not disrespectfully, just saying, I believe he's hoaxing. I believe his videos are hoaxed, right? And I stepped out of the vehicle from the airport, and he welcomed me. He gave me a hug, welcomed me into his house, and fed me. Like, I mean, of course, you know, in retrospect, I look back now and think, well, he would have kind of been stupid not to treat me that way, because ultimately I think his long game was, Brian's going to come up here. He's going to enjoy the trip. He's going to have some experiences, and he's going to hopefully go back and tell his audience that he had a great time, and that I am a great dude, and that's going to be great for business. Right. So again, he's not stupid. He's a good businessman. He's great at what he does. That's his full-time living. Bigfoot is his full-time living. Make no qualms about it.
How
He's-
much does he charge per person to come up there? I heard it's like a ridiculous amount.
I have heard so many different things. I couldn't even begin to tell you. I didn't go through that
Okay.
process. So, but I've heard it's upward of 3,000, 3,500. I've heard 4,000. I have no idea.
I heard recently someone said he quoted them at $10,000 for a week.
Are you serious?
I was like, if he just takes a few people out for the whole year, like he goes out a couple weeks at a year, he's set for the rest of the year.
Wow. Well, I can tell you, I know they are booked almost solidly week after week after week after week through the entire season. And they start, I frankly don't know when they start, but they go. I was one of the last expeditions for that year last year, and it was just me. It was just me, and I had Todd there. Ashley, his research partner and girlfriend, was there, and Kyle, one of his other. Kyle's been on the show a couple of times. Kyle does expeditions and helps Todd with the expeditions, and Kyle's dad was there. So it wasn't like, I mean, sometimes there's 3 or 4 people on expedition at one time. This was basically just for me. So I got the full 7-day experience without having all the other stuff and other people. So, but I know they had an expedition. I think he had a father and son out there the week after I left. And I think that was it for the year, because it starts to snow and it just gets really cold. And when you're 18 miles back and you don't have any electricity or any of the comforts of home, it gets a little rough during that time of year. So they kind of close things down. And according to him, they do it for the Sasquatch. They give them that time to sort of leave them alone and let them do their own thing, because they've kind of gotten used to this rhythm of when the humans are going to be there, kind of thing. So again, that's a very Toddism kind of thing. He's got an answer for everything when it comes to his research area and why people do what they do and why the Sasquatch do what they do. And you know.
I feel like he's the type of person to I can't speak on like I know the guy because I've never even spoke to him before, but just from what I've listened to him on other shows and watched, I feel like he actually believes though everything that he says. I don't feel like he's being dishonest or he realizes he's being dishonest, if that makes any sense. Like I feel like what he's trying to do, I think he's actually genuine about what he's trying to do. But I think there's other methods that he's done that's not been so honest.
I used to think the same thing or very similar to the same thing about Todd, but having gone on that trip and then having some of the things that have transpired between he and I since that trip, I no longer believe that. I think that there are some parts of it that are true. I do, at the core, I believe that Todd believes Sasquatch exists because I think he's had interactions and possibly even seen one. But beyond that, I think everything else is so much of a, I don't know what the word, maybe charade for him. It's a constant.
He's a character.
It's exactly. We said it at the same time. Character. He has developed this character that has overtaken his life. I mean, it's literally his life all day, every day, all the time. And I think that has just become, once you play that character, I mean, it's like any great character you think that's been on the air, these shows that's been on the air for 15, 20 years. Those actors, I guarantee you, in some way, shape, or form or fashion, even though that's just a job and it's just a character they play, would it be easy for them sometimes to just default to that character? I guarantee you it would. In real life. I mean, you just think about it. You play a character on television, you play Roseanne. Is Roseanne Barr partly Roseanne on the show and vice versa? Absolutely. So I think that's what's happened with Todd and Bigfoot. I think Todd Standing has become a character for him and he just lives it. Now he does live the life. He does live boots on the ground. I've seen this guy. We're sitting around the campfire and it's 30 degrees and I'm freezing and he's sitting there barefoot in shorts. This dude he's really boots on the ground. He knows that area. He's fit. He goes out. He does the hikes. He does the thing, right? But that's part of the character. And he does it well. I've gotten to the point where some of the things that have happened, I mean, we had a falling out over that whole debacle. I don't even know if you're familiar with it. I wasn't until somebody brought it to my attention. There's this big gondola up in Canada that has fallen a couple of times. And Todd claimed that it was Bigfoot cutting the cable or smashing the cable and bringing down this gondola. It was the weirdest thing. It's one of the weirdest things we've talked about on that Bigfoot podcast. And I just got into an episode one day and I told Wayne, I said, Todd has just gone so far off the rails that he could have done some different things in the past. And I think his path would have taken a different turn and he could be a different character in Bigfoot if he had chosen to go a different route. But every time he has an opportunity to come to the table and just have an honest, open conversation about reality, he drives us to Cookerville. And I'm just not ready to get in the car and go to Cookville with him anymore. And Todd took offense to that and said I called him a kook, and he called me lots of bad names, and we don't talk anymore. So, but that's just how I feel, man. I really do think he could be somebody who really helps push the research down the field. But I think he's just gotten to the point where he just goes through the motions and he plays this character over and over, and he just does what he needs to do to get people up there for expeditions and make his living. And I don't really fault the guy for that. I mean, he's made a living on YouTube. He's got like 120,000 followers on YouTube, and he posts clickbait titles with clickbait images, and it's just Todd talking about the same thing that happened 15 years ago, and people eat it up, man. And he has that gift to do that. And as long as he's going to continue to do that and the community at large continues to fall for that kind of crap, it's going to continue to happen. I mean, there's so many people that are in that same vein with Todd, Dr. Matthew Johnson and other people we've talked about on the show that just perpetuate this craziness, and people fall for it. They hook, line, and sinker believe everything these people say, and it really hurts the other researchers out there who are trying to do the right thing the right way, in my opinion. And that's one of the reasons we started that Bigfoot podcast, was to talk about some of those people and call them out. I mean, there's very few people doing that in the community. I don't want to be the Bigfoot police, but I can express my opinion. And, the show's become very popular. I can tell you that. We're about 50 episodes in at this point, and people are eating it up. They love that kind of dialogue, I think. It's something that's been missing in the community for such a long time, is when we see a pareidolia picture, we call it out and say it's trees and leaves. Move on, right? Yeah, let's stop looking at this stuff.
That's my biggest struggle, is when people send me stuff that I don't see it. Like, literally, I see a red circle on a bunch of blurry leaves, and they're like, "Oh, you don't see the face?" No, like, I don't. I see leaves. I could see where the shape of the leaves could be, I guess, contorted into a weird looking face, but to me, that's not a face. And that's my biggest struggle when it comes to all these cryptid photos, not just Bigfoot, but like anytime you see a photo, they're usually blurry. And the ones that are super clear, they're instantly wrote off as AI now, or fake. And I think that's what's going to be hard for anyone now to try and prove things. Even if you were to actually catch a full-on Bigfoot walking, no one's going to believe it these days, because they're going to say it's AI, because that's the reality we live in at this point.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, because so many people like Todd and others have laid the foundation for the hoaxing. And now, as the tools get better for people to hoax, it's just going to continue to get worse and worse. But we continue to do it, man. We're going to continue to call people out. And I mean, it's gotten to the point where I have to be careful who I bring on the show. It's happened to me a couple of times with people who recognize the popularity of the show, and they want to sort of make a name for themselves, and they've had an encounter and they want to come on and share their encounter. And then, lo and behold, that episode airs, and then the next thing I see on social media, they've started their own Facebook group. They're now going to become a podcaster. They've started a YouTube channel. They're doing a documentary, and it's all based on their encounter story that they shared on Sasquatch Odyssey. I'm like,
There's a lot of people that do that.
And they're sharing pareidolia pictures in their groups. I mean, Wayne literally texted me a couple right before I got on with you tonight. There's one person in particular who is just continuously posting pictures of trees and claiming it's Dog Man, and he's been chased by Dog Man and chased by Bigfoot, and he's scared. He was going to leave research for a while because he just couldn't handle it. Just perpetuating this bullshit narrative, and I'm over it. And I don't like to call people out. Like, I'll call Todd out because Todd makes a living at this. He's a big personality. I don't tend to call out just Joe Schmo hoaxers or Joe Schmo pareidolia guys, but it's getting to a point where, if you're going to use my platform as a jumping off point, or a springboard for this stuff, if you continue to do it long enough and you start selling t-shirts and hats, which, funny enough, this guy's starting to do, you're starting to make a little bit of money off of it, I'm probably going to have to burst the bubble, dude, because it's just pareidolia. That's it. And I'm really at a point where I don't know if this guy is delusional and he really believes it, like kind of like the Todd thing you said earlier. I'm still on the fence, but I don't know how you could believe that, because if you're telling the story and saying, yeah, I saw him, he's right there. That's a Dog Man. And you got to know that's a tree, dude. There's something in me that says you probably know that's a tree, and you're just trying to pass it off as something else. And these people are eating it up. They're swallowing it hook, line, and sinker. So I don't know. Maybe that show's coming on that Bigfoot podcast. We might just have to.
I 100% am positive I know who you're talking about, and I will talk to you about it off air, because when you started talking, I mean, I think I was thinking of the same exact person right when you started talking about it, before you mentioned some of the things. I was like, I have a feeling I know who this person is. So
it's sad.
Yeah. But there is so many people that do that. And then I don't know. I get hesitant about some of the guests that I've had out here. And there was someone that reached out to me yesterday, and I told them that I would be willing to do an interview. But then I started seeing the stuff that they were sending me, and I'm very hesitant. I don't want to speak on it on air in case they're listening. But like, I don't see some of the things that they're seeing, and I don't know how to go about not sounding like a dick. But like, I don't see what you're seeing. Like, I can buy into and keep an open mind, but like, I don't see anything here. And if the whole interview is based off of what you're finding in these photos don't show me anything. So if I'm not going to believe it, why should a listener listen to it? Like, if someone suffers from like a mental illness, I'm not going to put them on air just because I need an episode. You know what I mean? That's not how I go about it. Like, if you'd have something wrong and you're literally seeing monsters in photos and I just see trees, there's either I'm blind to it or there's something else going on. You know what I mean? So I don't know how to navigate the waters. It's always tricky for me to try and pick and choose who I have on the show.
Yeah, I've dealt with that so many times, and I've gotten to the point where I just tell people that's exactly what I say. I don't see what you're seeing. And if I can't see what you're seeing, then I'm not confident moving forward with an interview about based on what you're saying that you're seeing that I don't see. Because if I can't see it, the majority of my audience is probably not going to be able to see it. So there's not really a story there for them to connect to. And that's just how I handle it. But I get that it's rare because I usually get that on the tail end. I again, unless somebody is really pushing evidence and I get it beforehand, like you've obviously gotten, that's one thing. But a lot of people that come afterwards. It happens with a lot of habituation situations that I've had people on the show about. And it seems that those are the worst because these people, I interviewed a lady, it was probably beginning of this year, late last year. She came on the show and said, she had been interacting with this clan of Bigfoot around her house for decades. And then she moves to another state, and part of the clan followed her to another state, like 700 miles away. And I was like, okay. And I let her tell her story. And she keeps talking about photos and she keeps talking about all these situations. And I finally said to her during the interview, I said, you must have some amazing photo and video evidence. If you've been interacting with the clan of Sasquatch this closely to the point where they're bringing their babies and toddlers and leaving them in your backyard so you can, quote, babysit them, you've got to have some amazing photographs. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've got tons of photographs. I'd love to send them to you. Oh, please do. I'll post those up on the blog, on the website for you guys that are listening to check out. 25 photos the next day, nothing but leaves, trees, sticks, and blob squatches. It's the worst thing ever. And it happens so many times. I've interviewed several people that have claimed to have these semi or what you would consider a habituation situation with Sasquatch, and it's never failed. No evidence whatsoever that is convincing to me, other than sticks, leaves, and trees, and what looks like pitiful examples of pareidolia. And again, the stories are so compelling, they're so convincing, and these people seem to really believe what they're telling me. And I don't know what it is. I literally had a conversation with a lady. It hasn't aired yet. I did this months ago. I've probably been sitting on this interview for 3-4 months, maybe even longer. This lady was telling me she takes photos of Bigfoot, and she's trying to convince me that you have to train yourself to see the Bigfoot in the photos because they don't show themselves to just anybody. You have to be ready to see them. You have to be willing to see them, and you have to be open-minded enough to see them. And I'm like, I don't know what you do with that. I mean, you're explaining an enigma wrapped in a mystery, poked in another enigma. It just doesn't make sense to me. You can't explain things that way. It doesn't make sense. She's like, I can send you these photos, but you're probably not going to see them. They're right there, but you're not going to see them.
I literally had someone just within the last few days send me something and basically gave me the ultimatum that if I don't see what they're seeing, then I'm in on the cover up. And by being in on the cover up, I work with a trafficking cabal that it was just straight. I was like, what? I haven't even like acknowledged at this point. It's like, how do you follow that? Like, if you don't see what I'm seeing, you're a child trafficker. What? That's just straight up insane shit.
It's crazy, man. It's a crazy world, but that's why I keep coming back. Here we are.
Yeah. I started this because I wanted to find answers, and instead of finding answers, I've just come away with more questions. So the further I go down the rabbit hole, the more and more nothing makes any sense.
We're in the same boat, rowing in the same river, my friend.
Hmm. Well, Brian, we haven't really talked much about your book. I figure we've been going on here for about an hour and a half. We can wrap this up here soon, but want to give you a chance to talk about your book and whatever else it is you want to talk about before we go off here.
Yeah, I'll be quick about the book. The book is a little bit about my experience. I start with my experience when I was a kid. I talk about some of the stories that I grew up hearing in the North Georgia mountains. And then I go into a lot about Bigfoot and pop culture. There's a entire chapter on Bigfoot and pop culture, what that means. I get into the scientific method. I break down evidence. I talk a lot about evidence because a lot of people say, skeptics, and I'm in that. We've talked about my skeptical side. I'm certainly one of those people that you got to show me the evidence. But there's a lot of people who say there isn't a lot of evidence for Bigfoot. So there actually is. If you just go on the anecdotal stories and look at those, but there's a lot of physical evidence. There's a lot of things out there. If you dig deep enough, you'll find it. So I do a chapter on evidence, breaking down what evidence actually is. I think I named the chapter, Can We Convict Sasquatch in a Court of Law? So I've joked about that on the show before. If Sasquatch were in a court of law on trial for being real or not, I think we would have probably been able to convict him based on just criminal statutes alone by a jury. So going to the scientific method, you talked a little bit about the bodies and why they're not found. I do a chapter on where the bodies and talk about the fossil record. Less than 1% of our entire fossil record is actually there and complete because it's very difficult to produce a fossil. So I go into the science of fossilization. I know that sounds really compelling for a lot of people who are probably waiting to read that with bated breath. It kind of sounds boring, but it's really not. I tried to make it as interesting as possible. And then I talk about some of the behaviors that are known for primates that could be something that Sasquatch employs to hide in plain sight, why they're so stealthy. I try to explain that sort of scientifically, and it's not this woo thing. They're the biggest, fastest, they disappear, those kind of things. I go into known primate behavior and kind of break that down and compare it to what Sasquatch could be doing. I talk a little bit about human population growth and wilderness loss and how that could affect Sasquatch. And then I talk about some of the woo, the high strangeness. I get into some of the habituation situations that I've talked to people about and some of the other more popular ones and what I think about those. And then I just talk about our fascination with monsters and cryptids and our escapism in the modern world and how that sort of affects how the Bigfoot phenomenon plays out for a lot of us. And then I close out talking about the truth behind the legend. And I've talked about it before. This is not really a spoiler alert. People have reached out to me. The Coalition for Critical Thinking group on Facebook, there's a lot of yahoos in there that don't believe in Bigfoot, and they give me shit all the time for my show.
I've experienced that so far.
And, there's a lot of great dudes in there. They're not all bad, but, like Stephen Stroyford, the guy who started the group, and it's pretty well known in Bigfoot. I've had Stephen on my show. He's kind of the grumpy guy in Bigfoot that doesn't believe anything. But, Stephen's asked me, well, when was Sasquatch ever leashed? And what's the truth behind the legend? How did you find that out? Well, honestly, for me and everybody else, the truth is what you choose to believe. I mean, we've kind of talked about that all night. Is your truth is different from mine. My truth is different from yours, and somebody else's truth may be even different from both of ours. But the truth really is what you choose to believe about the legend. Once you put all the information together, and hopefully that's what you do in the book, is kind of, it leads you to the point where you have enough information to draw your own truth based on what I've talked about in the book and maybe what you've possibly heard on my show or some of the other shows and what other people have had to say. But the truth behind the legend really is what we believe it is. It's different for everybody. So that's kind of where I wanted the book to end for people. And people have already asked me if I'm going to write another book. I can tell you, not like that. It's not going to happen like that. I may do some sort of an encounters book at some point because I've amassed so many encounters. Like I think 450 some odd episodes into Sasquatch Odyssey at this point. So there's a ton of encounter stories there that people have shared that I may eventually put into book form that are for people that are interested in it. But I don't know. It's definitely not something I'm working on. I've got a ton of speaking stuff coming up and a lot of travel. I'm going to the UK in July, man. I'm speaking at a conference over there as a headliner. Me, Jeff Meldrum. They've got quite a few people lined up for that. So a lot of travel coming up, which I enjoy. I love getting out and meeting people. I've been out selling the book. You know, we hung out in Ohio a couple of weeks ago with Cliff and Meldrum, and Matt Pruitt was there. They had a great lineup. Mark DeWorth does it's a fantastic conference. If you guys have never experienced the Ohio Bigfoot Conference, it was definitely on my bucket list, and I got to check that off. Cliff invited me to come out and hang out with him, and we signed books and sold a bunch of books that day. So if you guys get a chance to check it out, you should definitely do it. But yeah, that's the book, man. You can get it anywhere you want. Amazon is the go-to place for everybody. It's on Barnes and Noble. Anywhere you find books, you can get it on Kindle. You can buy it directly from Hanger One Publishing. Doug Hychek and those guys, his sons Alex and Blaine, run the production or the publication company that published the book. And you can get it on our website, paranormalworldproductions.com. There's a store button at the top of the page. We've still got a couple of copies that I brought back from Ohio that are signed by Cliff. I think we've got 3 of those left at this point. They'll probably be gone way before this airs, but we sell autographed copies of the book directly from our website. That's the only place you can get an autographed copy from me or see me in person, you know, at some of the events we have coming up.
Are you familiar with the Indiana Bigfoot Conference that's happening? I'm from Indiana, and in September they're doing the first annual Indiana Bigfoot Conference, so I have a booth set up for that. I don't know if you've heard anything about it because I don't know how much advertisement's been done for it yet.
No, I haven't heard of that one. No.
Yeah, it's down in Nashville, Indiana. It's on the 27th and 28th of September. And Nashville's a pretty big hotspot here around Indiana for Sasquatch sightings. So the Indiana Bigfoot Research Organization, I believe is what they're called, is putting on. I interviewed the guy. His episode came out last week. But no, I'm going to be a vendor for that. And then there's a couple other ones I'm actually going to be doing some stuff at too. There's one up in Michigan too, Bigfoots and Brews and Spirits too. So that's happening up there. So there's a few of them I'm going to be at too. But that's the one thing I've started to look into more is I would like to go to some of these events just to try and meet with people, maybe find some new guests and help get the word out about the podcast too.
Yeah, it's a great place to do that. You said September 27th and 28th?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm speaking. I'm the headline speaker at the Ozark Mountain Bigfoot Conference on the 27th and 28th of September. And we're actually doing a camp out afterwards. I'm going to be camping out for a couple of days after the event with some of the other conference goers. So I'm looking forward to that. It's the first time I've been to Missouri and hung out. So I don't know. Should be interesting.
I never thought there was a Sasquatch type of creature living around here in Indiana because everything I see around here is just cornfields, but apparently there's been quite a few sightings around here, especially down the southern part. I'm more in the northern part of Indiana, so it seems down south towards where it starts to get mountainy, hilly and stuff, there's a lot more activity, which again, a few years ago I would have never thought anything about it. I've been doing the podcast for 2 years and it's pretty much opened my eyes to a lot of the weird stuff that's apparently going on all around us.
Hey, Bigfoot likes corn, man. Everybody likes corn, right?
There's more corn in Indiana is the saying, so I guess now we know what some of that more is.
There you go.
Well, Brian, it's been a pleasure talking with you. You want to let the audience know one more time where they can find your podcast, what's it called, and what's your book called, and everything else, and we can wrap this one up.
Yeah, man. Sasquatch Odyssey is the flagship show for Paranormal World Productions. You can get Sasquatch Odyssey, Paranormal Odyssey, That Bigfoot Podcast. I do a show called Backwoods Horror Stories. It's where I narrate really cool Bigfoot stories, Dogman stories, lots of other weird stories that people submit. We cultivate some of those from some of the BFRO and some of the other places out there. We get them from all over, but a lot of them are submitted via email. So Sasquatch Odyssey, Paranormal Odyssey, Backwoods Horror Stories, That Bigfoot Podcast, and I also do a true crime podcast called True Crime Odyssey. You can find that anywhere you listen to this show, any podcast app that's out there. You can find those shows. All you got to do is search them and they will pop up, and you got tons of catching up to do. There's tons of episodes out there to catch up on. So we'd love to have you.
I'll make sure to include links in my show notes for anyone out there listening. But Ryan, it's been a pleasure talking with you. You were one of the ones that the podcast people that I've had on my list. Like I said, I had a list of people I wanted to talk to, so I'm glad I had the chance to have you on here and talk with you for a little bit.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate it. I had a blast.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And for anyone out there listening, thanks for listening, and good night. And that's the show, everyone. I really hope you guys enjoyed the conversations. If you would like to be a guest on Tinfoil Tales, remember to send an email to tinfoiltalespodcast@gmail.com or go to the contact section of tinfoiltales.com. Just get your message to me. We'll get something scheduled for a future episode. And just remember, the truth lies in the stories we share, the connections we make. Stay curious, stay open-minded. Thank you all for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep exploring the unknown. Good night, everyone.
Tinfoil Tales in the headphones. Yeah, it's time to rock. Got a story about a cryptic creature. Let's take a walk. Bigfoot, dogman, they're out there in the dark. But the truth is out there like an alien spark. UFO sightings got the whole world shook. Conspiracies unfold like a story in a book. Media control, trying to keep us blind. Oh, before gonna use my own mind. In history, they don't want us to know the secrets they hide, the truth they won't show. Dominate our society, they keep us in chains. But I'm standing tall, it's time to break the reins. Control, trying to keep us blind, but I won't be fooled, gonna use my own mind. In history